You've heard their names, but not on television. They don't run for office, speak at forums, or give interviews, but they decide how much your food, your mortgage, and even your currency will cost. They are the families who own the right to print money. Their influence has outlasted empires and revolutions. Who are they? How did they gain power over the global economy? And is it true that one clan controls the world's banks? Are you ready to learn what is not openly discussed? It all began in the days when Europe was just getting a taste of trade and money. The Middle Ages gave rise to the first merchants, and merchants gave rise to the first bankers. But it was during the Renaissance that true financial dynasties began to form. One of the first such dynasties was the Medici, powerful Florentine bankers who skillfully combined finance with politics and art. However, the true history of the families credited with power over the global financial system began later, in the 18th century. At the center of this story is the Rothschild family, a name that has become synonymous with mysterious power and hidden influence. The founder of the dynasty, Mayer Amschel Rothschild, was born in Frankfurt am Main in 1744. He started small, trading coins and antiques, but soon established connections with German princes, including William IX, Landgrave of Hesse Castle. It was thanks to these connections that Rothschild gained access to enormous amounts of money, which he then channeled into the right hands, with a profit for himself. Mayer's 5 sons were scattered across key financial capitals of Europe: London, Paris, Naples, Vienna, and Frankfurt. Thus began a transnational empire in which money traveled faster than armies, and information was more valuable than gold. The Rothschilds were the first to create a system for transmitting news between their branches, which gave them a huge advantage. They knew what was going to happen before anyone else. In the 19th century, the dynasty became the largest financial player in Europe. Their influence extended to governments, monarchs, and even the papal throne. During the Napoleonic Wars, they financed armies on both sides, skillfully maneuvering between interests. After the Battle of Waterloo, it was Nathaniel Rothschild in London who allegedly first learned of the British victory, and, according to an unconfirmed legend, used this knowledge to crash the stock market, buy up shares at bargain prices, and then make a huge profit when the truth came out. But the Rothschilds were not alone. Others were growing in the shadows. The Warburg family, Jewish bankers from Hamburg, who would later play a key role in the creation of the U.S. Federal Reserve System. The Lazards family, originally from France, who later moved to the United States and founded one of the most influential investment banks. Kuhn Loeb were another powerful Jewish dynasty, whose connections with the Rockefellers and railroad magnates formed the foundation of American capitalism. All these families had one thing in common. They didn't just lend money. They made the rules. Their interests weren't just in making money, but in controlling who got money, how, and when. That meant they controlled who made the decisions. By the beginning of the 20th century, these dynasties were no longer just participating in the economy. They were shaping it. Their names were rarely mentioned in newspapers. They did not seek fame. They were only interested in power, the kind that does not require loud words. And this is where the real story of the clan that controls the world's money begins. At the beginning of the 20th century, the United States was experiencing a period of rapid growth, but along with it, financial instability. The economy was becoming increasingly complex, and the banking system was unable to cope with sudden crises. In 30 years, the country experienced several devastating bank panics. The most powerful of these occurred in 1907. It was this crisis that led to the creation of the Federal Reserve System, a central bank that was formally supposed to stabilize the economy. But behind the scenes of this process were not representatives elected by the people, but a few influential individuals whose names are rarely mentioned in textbooks. In November 1910, 7 people secretly arrived on the private island of Jekyll Island in Georgia. Among them were a senator from Rhode Island, a high-ranking official from the U.S. Treasury Department, and, most importantly, representatives of the country's largest banks and investment houses. Among them were Paul Warburg, a representative of the Warburg family, and Frank Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank, which was associated with the Rockefellers. Also present was Henry Davidson, a partner of J.P. Morgan. This meeting was kept strictly secret. The participants traveled under assumed names, avoided photographers, and did not even tell their families where they were going. The reason for the meeting was a plan to create a new central bank, independent of the government, but capable of controlling the money supply, regulating interest rates, and supporting the banking system in times of panic. Over the next 3 years, the Jekyll Island Plan was refined, modified, encumbered with legal wording, and finally presented as the Federal Reserve Act. In December 1913, the U.S. Congress approved it. President Woodrow Wilson signed the law on Christmas Day, when most senators and journalists had left for home. Thus, without much fanfare, America got a central bank created with the participation of private financial interests. The Fed was divided into 12 regional reserve banks, but the key role in the system was played by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. It served Wall Street and was directly linked to global financial flows. Charles Hamlin became the first chairman of the Fed, but real power was in the hands of those who controlled the banks and capital: the Rockefellers, Morgans, and Warburgs. Paul Warburg, who played a decisive role in drafting the bill, became one of the first members of the Fed's Board of Governors. His brother, Max Warburg, simultaneously headed the Central Bank of Germany. Thus, the world's 2 largest economies came under the indirect control of a single family. Critics of the new order said that the Fed had become a tool of the financial elite. Its formal subordination to Congress did not prevent private entities from influencing decisions related to interest rates, currency issuance, and credit policy. Opponents pointed out that the dollar was now created out of debt. The Fed printed money and lent it to the economy at interest. This meant that every banknote was burdened with debt from the outset, and the economy was dependent on those who controlled its issuance. Criticism was particularly fierce during periods of crisis. In 1929, the Great Depression hit millions of Americans, but the Fed was unable or unwilling to prevent the disaster. The largest banks survived. Many smaller ones were destroyed, and once again, the same names appeared behind the scenes. Thus, the Federal Reserve System, supposedly created for stability, became a symbol of hidden power. It is not entirely state-owned. Its charter capital belongs to private banks, which receive dividends from the Fed's profits. This means that profits are directly dependent on the volume of operations, including debt. The history of its creation is the history of an alliance between the government and financiers, not for the sake of the people, for the sake of control. And behind this control, the silhouette of those who stood at the printing press from the very beginning is becoming clearer. And this silhouette has not changed for over 100 years. After the creation of the Federal Reserve System in the United States, the key financial clans did not stop there. On the contrary, their ambitions went beyond the borders of a single country. The process of capital globalization began, in which international banks became not just intermediaries. They became instruments of influence. And it was here that dynasties such as the Rothschilds, Warburgs, Lazards, and Rockefellers strengthened their presence on the world stage. In Europe, the Rothschilds remained the main force. Their branches in London, Paris, and Vienna coordinated large international loans, including financing for the construction of railways, telegraph networks, and even wars. They were advisors to monarchs and finance ministries. In London, their influence on the Bank of England was not official, but the weight of their advice could not be overestimated. In Paris, they worked closely with the central bank and the government of the Third Republic. Their capital crossed borders before it became a global trend. At the same time, the Lazard dynasty was strengthening its position in the United States. Their bank, founded in the mid-19th century, became an important player on Wall Street. The Lazards were known for acting discreetly but effectively. They did not seek publicity, but actively advised governments on privatization, restructuring, and transnational deals. By the end of the 20th century, Lazard had become one of the world's leading investment banks, particularly influential in Europe and South America. At the same time, the Kuhn and Loeb clan, who had emigrated from Germany and settled in New York, grew in power. They financed the construction of American railways, including the famous Harriman Network. Their ties with the Rockefellers were strengthened in the early 20th century through joint investments in Standard Oil and other industrial giants. It was from the ranks of Kuhn and Loeb that a man named Jacob Schiff emerged, who actively influenced U.S. politics and finance and, according to some sources, financed revolutionary movements abroad, including in Russia. But the real breakthrough came with the emergence of international organizations that became the pinnacle of the new financial pyramid. After World War II, the Bretton Woods system was created, which gave rise to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Although these structures were formally controlled by states, the real power lay with the financial interests of those behind the largest central banks. The councils and working groups of the IMF and the World Bank were often formed from representatives of the same circles. Those who had passed through Goldman Sachs, Lazard, J.P. Morgan, and similar structures. Financial dynasties did not simply adapt to the new world. They designed it. Among the instruments of influence were the so-called revolving door principle, whereby officials from government structures moved to work in private banks, and then returned to ministries or international organizations. This practice ensured a constant flow of loyal specialists to key management positions. Investment funds played a special role. Through them, dynasties increased their influence while remaining in the shadows. The BlackRock Fund, for example, manages assets exceeding the annual GDP of most countries in the world. And although formally it does not belong to the Rothschilds or Rockefellers, chains of influence, investment ties, and intersections on the board of directors often point to a clan structure of capital. This is how a system was formed in which money knows no boundaries, but influence always ends up in the same hands. The global financial network has tightly woven together the continents, but at its center are old families who have long been accustomed to the fact that power does not necessarily have to be official. The main thing is to hold the keys to the cash register. Economic crises are a disaster for the majority. Losses, bankruptcies, rising unemployment. But for a select few, they are an opportunity to redistribute assets, strengthen control, and wipe out competitors. Financial dynasties that have built their empires over centuries have learned not just to survive crises, they have learned to profit from them, and even to provoke them, if necessary. The first major shock of the 20th century was the Great Depression. Beginning in 1929 with the collapse of the New York Stock Exchange, it spread across the globe. Millions of people lost their jobs, thousands of banks closed, farmers lost their land, and businesses lost their orders. But the biggest players, with their liquidity and insider information, bought up assets at bargain prices. J.P. Morgan, one of the pillars of the banking elite, made a series of deals that allowed his bank to strengthen its position even amid the general collapse. Instead of mitigating the crisis, the Federal Reserve acted indecisively and, in some cases, only exacerbated the situation. Many historians and economists, including Milton Friedman, later blamed the Fed for the failure of monetary policy. But for the families that controlled the banks, the crisis was a moment of consolidation. The weak disappeared, the strong grew stronger. The fear of the population paved the way for deeper financial centralization. The next round came in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when the United States abandoned the gold standard. In 1971, President Richard Nixon announced that the dollar would no longer be backed by gold. This meant that money was now completely subject to the policies of central banks. Money supply was no longer limited by anything other than the decisions of a small circle of rulers. And once again, behind these decisions were familiar names, albeit hidden from the eyes of the general public. Global inflation, oil shocks, sharp currency fluctuations, all this was accompanied by the acceleration of financial globalization. International banks, already accustomed to waves of crisis, skillfully maneuvered between disasters. They created derivatives, hedge funds, and shadow structures. The complexity of the system became a shield. The less understandable it was, the more difficult it was to regulate. The crisis of 2008 occupies a special place in this story. The mortgage bubble in the United States burst, leading to the collapse of major banks, insurance companies, and funds. Another surprise, although some analysts had long warned of the impending disaster. But once again, the government saved the banks, not the people. Trillions of dollars went to bailouts, financial aid to those who, in essence, created the problem in the first place. And who won? Companies closely linked to the authorities and central banks. Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, Citigroup, all of them emerged from the crisis alive, and some even stronger. Small players were swallowed up. The market became even more monopolized. After every crisis, there are fewer independent banks in the world and more concentration of capital in the hands of transnational structures. And if you trace the chains of ownership and control, many of them lead back to the same families who were there at the beginning, even if their names are now hidden behind trusts, foundations, and boards of directors. For the general public, crises are natural disasters. For those in the know, they are a tool. And with this tool, one thing is important. Always be ready to buy when others are losing. Have access to money when the market freezes. And most importantly, participate in the decisions that determine when the crisis will begin and when it will end. In the 21st century, money has become digital, information instantaneous, and those in power almost invisible. While presidents and ministers come and go on our screens, the real players remain in the shadows. The financial dynasties that formed in the 18th and 19th centuries continue to exert influence, but they do so much more subtly than before. Their strategy is no longer to directly own banks, but to exercise indirect control through funds, institutions, and information networks. One of the key mechanisms of modern influence is investment funds and holding structures. They allow capital to be concentrated and managed through complex chains of ownership. In these chains, surnames have long disappeared from the forefront, but remain on the boards of directors, management committees, charitable foundations, and educational institutions. Thus, a name may disappear from the headlines, but its influence remains at the levels where decisions are made. A classic example of such a structure is the BlackRock Fund. This investment giant manages assets worth more than the gross domestic product of most countries in the world. Although it is presented as a public company, it is backed by a network of institutional investors, pension funds, trusts, and private individuals whose names are hidden behind a veil of confidentiality. Former BlackRock employees hold key positions at the IMF, the European Central Bank, and even in the administrations of world leaders. This is the very revolving door through which the elite rotate, Similar mechanisms operate at Vanguard, State Street, and other funds. They own significant stakes in major corporations, from technology giants to pharmaceutical and defense companies. Their influence is not necessarily in management, but in their ability to direct capital, change strategies, appoint or dismiss directors. And all this without public participation. International organizations have become another level of power. The World Economic Forum, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Bank for International Settlements are all not only expert platforms, but also centers of influence. Decisions made in Davos or Basel can affect national budgets, exchange rates, and trade relations. And in these forums, we once again encounter those associated with ancient dynasties. Even if the names are new, the origins and capital are old. Another powerful tool is control over information. In the digital age, when attention is currency, it is not only what is said that matters, but also what is not said. Media holdings, think tanks, research institutes, all these are channels for shaping the agenda. The Rothschilds, Rockefellers, and their heirs have long invested in controlling these flows, sometimes directly, sometimes through university funding, grants for independent research, or through stock holdings in corporations that own the media. But perhaps the most subtle form of power remains influence over thinking. Through educational programs, MBA courses, university lectures, and popular books, a new elite is being formed, one that is loyal to the system created by the previous elite. This is cultural hegemony, which is difficult to recognize, but even more difficult to break. And within this structure, the old financial clans feel confident. On the surface, the modern world seems chaotic and decentralized. But if you look deeper, beyond the numbers, brands, and slogans, you will find that the keys to the global economy have not changed hands. They are just hidden deeper now. And this is the main secret of these clans' longevity. They are no longer visible, but they are the ones who decide what tomorrow will look like. When it comes to families who control money, the line between documented history and conspiracy theory becomes particularly blurred. Names such as Rothschild, Rockefeller, Warburgs, and Lazards have become so overgrown with rumors and speculation that it is not easy for everyone to separate fact from fiction. Conspiracy theorists claim that a single clan completely controls the global financial system, orchestrates crises, appoints presidents, and develops global plans, from wars to pandemics. They point to closed clubs such as the Bilderberg Group or the Council on Foreign Relations as centers of global power. In these versions, the clans appear as almost supernatural beings capable of controlling not only money, but also the minds of the masses. But the historical truth is not so dramatic, though no less disturbing. Yes, families like the Rothschilds did play a key role in the development of the European banking system. Yes, the Rockefellers influenced the U.S. economy, medicine, and education for decades. Yes, their representatives participated in the creation of the Federal Reserve System and other institutions that govern the global economy. This is documented, verified, and confirmed. However, the idea of a single, secret government is more of a metaphor. Mechanisms of control and influence do exist, but they are not always centralized. Rather, it is a network in which old families pass power through institutions, ideologies, capital, and culture. This is not the plot of a spy thriller. It is a mechanism that has been built up over centuries. So why are they spoken of with such awe? Because they are not like others. Because they do not seek glory, but always find themselves close to power. Because their money has survived empires, revolutions, and world wars. Because they never disappear. They simply change form. That is why we talk about a clan. not as a secret organization with a coat of arms and a slogan, but as a multi-headed organism that feeds on time, influence, and silence. It does not openly demand power because it already has it, and perhaps it always has.